The strangest thing about that night wasn't that I gave my umbrella to a complete stranger. It was that he looked at me like I had just handed him something far more valuable. Rain hammered against the bus stop roof, hard enough to drown out the traffic. The storm had rolled into Manhattan faster than the weather forecast predicted, turning the streets into rivers of reflected neon and blurred headlights. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and checked the time on my phone. 9:47 p.m., another late night. Another stack of papers waiting to be graded when I got home. Being an elementary school teacher wasn't exactly glamorous, but I loved my students. Most days, that was enough. The bus was running behind schedule, and judging by the way the wind was bending the trees along Lexington Avenue, it might not show up anytime soon. A gust of icy rain slipped beneath the shelter and splashed against my shoes. Great, just great! I sighed and adjusted the handle of my umbrella. It was old. The navy fabric had faded in places, and one of the metal ribs bent slightly whenever the wind got too aggressive. But it worked, barely, and tonight that felt like a luxury. That was when I noticed him. He stood about 30 feet away from the bus stop beneath the weak glow of a street lamp. No umbrella, no jacket hood, no attempt to avoid the rain. He simply stood there. The storm poured over him in sheets, soaking his dark coat and turning his black hair almost silver beneath the light. Something about him felt unusual immediately, not because he was handsome, though he was, not because he looked wealthy, though even from a distance I could tell every piece of clothing he wore cost more than my monthly rent. No, it was the stillness. Everyone else rushed through storms. They ran for cover. They hurried toward warmth. But this man stood perfectly motionless, as if the weather had forgotten to touch him. I watched him longer than I probably should have, maybe because there was sadness in the way he stared across the street, maybe because loneliness recognizes loneliness. Whatever the reason, I couldn't stop looking. Then the wind shifted again, a stronger gust. Rain slammed directly into him. He blinked once but didn't move. "You have got to be kidding me," I muttered under my breath. Common sense told me to stay where I was. I barely knew the guy. Actually, I didn't know him at all. For all I knew, he was waiting for someone. For all I knew, he preferred standing in the rain. But my grandmother had always said something when I was growing up. If kindness feels inconvenient, that's usually when it matters most. Before I could overthink it, I stepped out of the shelter. Cold rain immediately soaked my sleeve. "Excuse me," I called. The man turned slowly. His eyes found mine. For a second, I forgot what I was about to say. They were striking eyes, dark, focused. The kind of eyes that looked like they noticed everything. I forced myself to continue walking until I stood a few feet away. "You should take this." I held out my umbrella. He looked at it, then at me, then back at the umbrella. "No," he said quietly. His voice was deep and calm. "You need it more. I live 6 blocks from here. It was closer to 8. I'll survive." A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe. Or confusion. "You don't know me," he said. That's usually how strangers work. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, not quite anything at all. The rain continued falling around us. Cars hissed through puddles. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed between buildings. "Take it," I said. Seriously, he stared at me for another moment, long enough that I began wondering if I had completely lost my mind. Then he reached forward and accepted the umbrella. His hand brushed mine briefly, cold from the rain. "Thank you," he said. 2 simple words. But the way he said them felt strange, almost like he hadn't spoken them in a long time. "You're welcome," I smiled. "Try not to catch pneumonia." Another almost smile appeared. This time I was sure of it. Tiny, fleeting, gone before I could fully see it. I stepped backward and shoved my hands into my coat pockets. The wind immediately attacked me. "Good night, Grace Morgan." I froze. My heart skipped. How do you know my name? But a city bus suddenly roared around the corner, its brakes screeching as it approached the stop. I glanced toward it instinctively. By the time I looked back, the man had already turned away. The umbrella was open above him now, shielding him from the rain, somehow making him look even more distant, more unreachable. The bus doors hissed open. People climbed aboard. I hesitated for a second before stepping inside. Maybe he had seen my school ID badge earlier. Maybe I'd forgotten I was still wearing it. That had to be it. It was the only explanation that made sense. Yet as the bus pulled away, I glanced through the fogged window one last time. The stranger remained standing beneath the umbrella, watching the bus disappear into the storm, and for reasons I couldn't explain, the sight stayed with me all the way home. I had no idea that night would change everything. I didn't know his name. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know that some of the most powerful people in New York stepped aside when he entered a room. I didn't know that he could have bought every umbrella in Manhattan without noticing the cost. All I knew was that a stranger had looked at me differently than anyone ever had before, like I'd given him something he thought the world no longer possessed. And as I walked the final blocks home through the cold rain, I never noticed the black SUV that appeared at the far end of the street, or the man sitting quietly in the back seat. Watching to make sure I reached my apartment safely, I did not sleep much that night. Not because of the storm, not because my clothes had been soaked through by the time I reached my apartment. It was because of the stranger. Something about the way he had looked at me lingered in my mind long after I should have forgotten him. By 7 o'clock the next morning, I was already standing in my classroom with a cup of coffee that tasted suspiciously like cardboard. The familiar sounds of students arriving filled the hallway, lockers opening, sneakers squeaking against polished floors, excited voices carrying through the building. Normally those sounds grounded me. They reminded me who I was, Grace Morgan. Third-grade teacher, ordinary person, ordinary life. Yet every few minutes my thoughts drifted back to a pair of dark eyes beneath a stormy Manhattan sky. By lunchtime I finally laughed at myself. It was ridiculous. New York City had millions of people. The chances of seeing that man again were practically zero. Life moved on, at least that was what I thought. Across the city, several floors above Manhattan traffic, Gabriel Romano stood beside a wall of glass overlooking the skyline. The umbrella rested against a leather chair a few feet away. Dry now, simple, faded navy blue. Worth maybe $20, yet it was the first thing his eyes had landed on when he entered the room. "You have a meeting in 20 minutes, one of his associates said carefully. Gabriel did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the umbrella. "Did you verify her information?" he finally asked. "Yes." The man handed him a folder. Grace Morgan, 27, elementary school teacher, lives alone on the Upper East Side. No criminal record, no significant debt, no unusual activity. Gabriel opened the file. A school photograph stared back at him. Grace smiled at the camera exactly the same way she had smiled beneath the genuine, completely unaware of how unusual that quality had become. Most people wanted something: money, influence, access, favors. Yet she had offered help to a stranger without asking for anything in return. "Keep your distance." "Sir, I do not want her disturbed." The associate looked confused. "Then why investigate her?" Gabriel closed the folder. "Because I wanted to know who gives away her only umbrella during a thunderstorm." The man wisely chose not to ask further questions. Meanwhile, my day continued exactly as normal. I taught fractions, settled an argument involving crayons, read 3 chapters of Charlotte's Web aloud to a classroom full of children who somehow found every excuse possible to avoid sitting still. By 4 o'clock I was exhausted. The storm had passed overnight, leaving behind clear skies and cool autumn air. I walked home carrying a stack of student assignments under one arm. Halfway down the block, I noticed something unusual. Construction workers stood outside a small community playground near my apartment building. That alone was not strange. What was strange was how quickly they were working. New benches, fresh paint, brand new equipment being unloaded from trucks. An elderly woman from my building stood nearby watching. "Do you know what happened?" I asked. She smiled. "Some anonymous donor paid for everything." I glanced toward the playground. Last week the city had announced there was no budget available for repairs. The swings had been broken for months. That was fast. Whoever donated must really care. I nodded and continued walking. Funny enough, the stranger crossed my mind again, not because I thought he had anything to do with it. That would have been absurd, but because something about unexpected kindness always reminded me of that rainy night. 3 blocks away, parked discreetly across the street, a black SUV remained motionless. Gabriel sat in the back seat reviewing documents. At least that was what he appeared to be doing. In reality, his attention drifted repeatedly toward the sidewalk outside. His driver glanced into the mirror. "You could simply introduce yourself." Gabriel looked up. "Why would I do that?" "Because following a school teacher from a distance every day seems inefficient." A rare hint of amusement touched Gabriel's expression. "I am not following her." The driver raised an eyebrow. "Of course not." Silence settled inside the vehicle. Outside, Grace stopped at a crosswalk. A little girl struggled to carry a box nearly half her size. Without hesitation, Grace crossed the street and helped her. No cameras, no audience, no reward, just kindness again. Gabriel watched the interaction carefully. Something unfamiliar tightened in his chest. Respect, perhaps, or curiosity. He had spent years surrounded by people whose loyalty depended on contracts, negotiations, and leverage. Grace Morgan seemed to operate according to entirely different rules. The light changed. She continued home, safe, unaware. Gabriel looked away first. "Let's go," he said quietly. The SUV pulled into traffic and disappeared. But as evening settled over Manhattan, neither of them realized that the brief encounter during the storm had already begun changing both of their lives. And somewhere inside Gabriel's office, resting beside a window overlooking the city, a faded navy umbrella remained exactly where he had left it. The following week should have been ordinary. Instead, it felt like the city had quietly shifted around me while I was not paying attention. Monday morning began with a surprise staff meeting. I walked into the teacher's lounge expecting budget discussions and scheduling headaches. Instead, our principal stood at the front of the room looking more excited than I had seen her in years. "I have good news," she announced. Every teacher immediately looked suspicious. Good news in public education usually came with a catch. An anonymous donor has provided funding for several community projects, including grants for local schools. The room fell silent. Then questions exploded from every direction. New books, update for aging classrooms, programs that had been cancelled years ago suddenly had a chance of returning. I sat quietly, listening as excitement spread through the room. It felt wonderful. The children deserved every bit of it. Yet for some reason my thoughts drifted back to a rainy night and a stranger standing beneath a street lamp. The connection made no sense. I pushed it away. By Wednesday afternoon, life seemed determined to prove that kindness could still exist in unexpected places. One of my students, a shy little boy named Ethan, arrived carrying a brand new backpack. His family had been struggling for months. The old one he carried had been held together with tape. When I complimented it, his face lit up. "Someone donated them," he said proudly. "Everybody in my class got school supplies too." Watching his smile warmed something deep inside me. Moments like that were why I love teaching. The world could be difficult, sometimes unfair, but every now and then people chose to make it better. Across the city, Gabriel Romano sat at the head of a long conference table while executives discussed numbers, investments, and future projects. Normally he absorbed every detail. "The educational initiative is complete," one of his advisors reported. Gabriel nodded. "Good." Another man glanced down at a report. "The community response has been overwhelmingly positive." Gabriel said nothing. Positive reactions had never interested him much. What interested him was a photograph resting beside his tablet, a photograph that had nothing to do with business. Grace Morgan standing outside her classroom surrounded by students, smiling, completely unaware that someone had captured the moment. He studied the image for a second longer before turning it face down. Something about her continued to occupy space in his thoughts. That was unusual. Dangerous even. He preferred certainty, structure, predictability. Grace represented none of those things. She simply appeared and changed the atmosphere around her. Meanwhile, I was discovering a different problem. Every morning for 3 straight days, I noticed the same along my route to work. Not always in the same place, not always at the same time, but close enough to catch my attention. The first time I ignored it. The second time I convinced myself it was coincidence. By the third day I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than normal. "You are being ridiculous," I muttered while unlocking my apartment door that evening. New York was filled with black SUVs. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. Still, the thought lingered. That night I stopped at a small grocery store a few blocks from home. The cashier was an older man named Frank who had worked there forever. Half the neighborhood knew him. As I paid for my groceries, he frowned toward the front window. "Storm coming again," he said. Dark clouds rolled across the skyline. "Not as severe as the first storm, but enough to send people hurrying home. Looks like it." Frank smiled. "You still carrying that umbrella around?" I laughed. "Not anymore. What happened to it?" The memory surfaced immediately. Dark eyes, rain, a quiet thank you. I gave it away. Frank blinked. "To who? A stranger? Only you would do something like that." I smiled and shrugged. Maybe he was right. Maybe it had been foolish, yet I did not regret it, not even for a second. Outside, the wind picked up. A few drops of rain tapped against the glass. Across the street, hidden behind tinted windows, Gabriel watched the grocery store entrance, not because he planned to approach her, not because he intended to interfere with her life. At least that was what he kept telling himself. The truth was harder to admit. Every day he expected his curiosity to fade. Every day it seemed to grow stronger instead. His driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "You know, she seems happy." Gabriel looked toward the store. Grace was laughing at something the cashier said. Her smile appeared effortless, genuine, rare. "Yes," Gabriel said quietly. "She does." The driver hesitated. "And you are making certain she stays that way?" Gabriel did not answer, because for the first time in years, he realized that was exactly what he was doing. A few minutes later, Grace stepped outside carrying 2 grocery bags. The first raindrops began falling as she headed home. She never noticed the black SUV waiting across the street. She never noticed it remain there until she safely disappeared inside her building. And she certainly never noticed the faint smile that appeared on Gabriel Romano's face as the vehicle finally pulled away into the gathering storm. The storm arrived just after midnight. I woke to the sound of rain striking my bedroom window and the distant rumble of thunder rolling between skyscrapers. For a few moments I lay there staring into the darkness, listening to the city breathe beneath the weather. Manhattan always sounded different during storms, sweeter, softer, as if even millions of people understood when nature wanted the stage for itself. By morning the rain had passed, leaving behind crisp air and streets washed clean. I stepped outside carrying a travel mug of coffee and immediately realized something was wrong. My car would not start. The engine sputtered once, coughed weakly, then gave up completely. "Come on," I muttered. "Not today." I tried again. Nothing. My aging sedan had never been reliable. I checked the clock. 7:32. If I left immediately and caught the subway, I could still make it to school on time. Barely. I locked the car and hurried toward the station. The entire commute I worried about repair costs. Teachers did not exactly have emergency luxury car budgets. Every unexpected expense felt personal. By lunch, I had already convinced myself the repair would cost thousands of dollars. Maybe the transmission, maybe the engine, maybe some mysterious mechanical problem designed specifically to destroy my savings account. That afternoon, after school ended, I walked back to the apartment building preparing for bad news. Instead, I found a note tucked beneath my windshield wiper. I frowned and unfolded it. "Identifit, Barry connection repaired, no charge. Have a nice day." I stared at the paper, then at the car, then back at the paper. "No charge," I whispered. Confused, I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine started immediately, perfectly, smoothly, like nothing had ever been wrong. For several seconds I simply sat there. New Yorkers were not known for randomly fixing strangers' vehicles out of kindness, at least not in my experience. Yet somebody had done exactly that. The mystery should have ended there. It did not. 2 days later, another strange thing happened. One of my students lost her inhaler during recess. The poor girl spent an hour fighting tears because her family could not easily replace it. Before I even had time to call her parents, the school nurse informed us that a local health foundation had donated emergency supplies to several schools in the district, including inhalers, including hers. The little girl hugged me so tightly I almost cried. That evening I sat alone in my apartment grading spelling tests and thinking about coincidences. Maybe they really were coincidences. Maybe life occasionally surprised people for the better. Yet a small voice inside my head kept whispering that something felt different lately. Outside, city lights shimmered through my window. Somewhere across Manhattan, Gabriel Romano sat inside his office reviewing reports that covered nearly half his desk. Normally he worked late without noticing the hours. Tonight his attention rested elsewhere. The vehicle issue has been resolved, one of his associates informed him. Gabriel looked up. The school donation was delivered as requested. Another nod. "Good." The associate hesitated. "Sir, if I may ask a question." Gabriel closed the folder in front of him. "You usually do anyway." A rare smile appeared on the man's face. Why all this effort for one person? Silence settled across the room. Gabriel stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of lights stretched across the darkness, countless stories unfolding at once. "Because she would do the same for someone else," he finally answered. The associate seemed unsure how to respond. Gabriel did not blame him. He was not entirely sure he understood it himself. All he knew was that every time Grace appeared in his thoughts, the city seemed slightly less cold than before. The next afternoon I stopped at a small bookstore near school. The owner knew me well enough to recommend novels before I even reached the counter. As I browsed the shelves, a familiar feeling returned. The strange sensation that someone was nearby watching, not in a threatening way, not even an uncomfortable way, just present. I glanced through the front window. Traffic moved normally. Pedestrians crossed intersections. Life continued. Then I saw it. A black SUV parked half a block away. My stomach tightened. There it was again. The same vehicle I had noticed several times over the past weeks. Maybe not the exact same one, but close enough. Similar shape, similar dark windows, similar timing. I laughed softly at myself. You are imagining things, Grace. Maybe I was. Yet when I left the bookstore 20 minutes later, the SUV was gone, vanished into the endless flow of Manhattan traffic, as though it had never been there at all. But later that night, while I stood at my apartment window watching clouds drift across the moonlit skyline, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere out there, an invisible thread had begun connecting two lives that should never have crossed paths. And neither of us knew where it was leading. The universe has a strange sense of timing. Just when you convince yourself that someone belongs in the past, they suddenly appear standing right in front of you. 2 weeks passed without anything unusual happening. At least that was what I kept telling myself. The mysterious repairs, the unexpected donations, the black SUV that seemed to exist only when I was not looking directly at it. I had managed to file all of it drawer labeled things I probably imagined. Life returned to its familiar rhythm: school, lesson plans, grocery runs, coffee that was never hot long enough. Then Saturday arrived. It was one of those perfect New York afternoons that felt borrowed from a movie. Bright blue skies stretched above the city. The air carried just enough autumn chill to justify a light jacket. Families filled the sidewalks. Street musicians played on corners. Weeks I had nowhere I needed to be, no papers to grade, no meetings to attend, no deadlines chasing me home. I wandered into a small independent bookstore near Bryant Park and spent nearly an hour getting lost between shelves. By the time I left, I was carrying 2 novels and a growing desire for caffeine. A coffee shop sat half a block away. Small, quiet, the kind of place where nobody rushed you out after finishing a drink. I stepped inside and immediately relaxed. Warm light filled the room. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers. The smell of fresh espresso drifted through the air. It felt like a refuge from the city outside. I ordered a vanilla latte and turned toward the seating area. Then my heart stopped, not literally, but close enough. He was sitting near the window, the stranger from the storm. For a second I genuinely wondered if I was imagining him. He looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more real. His dark hair was neatly styled. A charcoal sweater replaced the expensive coat I remembered. Sunlight filtered through the glass behind him, outlining his profile. Yet his eyes were exactly the same, calm, focused, impossible to forget. Before I could decide whether to leave or pretend I had not seen him, he looked up. Recognition appeared instantly. Grace. Hearing my name in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through me. "So you do know my name," I replied. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I suppose I do. And are you planning to tell me how?" He considered the question. "Your school identification badge." I blinked. "That is actually a reasonable explanation. I try to have one occasionally." To my surprise, I laughed. The sound seemed to amuse him. "May I?" I gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Of course." I sat down slowly. Part of me still felt slightly embarrassed by how often I had thought about this man. Another part could not believe I was actually speaking to him again. "You never returned my umbrella," I said. His expression became unexpectedly serious. "You are right." For a moment I worried I had offended him. Then he reached beside his chair and lifted something into view. My umbrella, the same faded navy fabric, the same bent metal rib. Somehow it looked cleaner than when I had owned it. "You brought it with you?" I asked. "I intended to return it if I ever saw you again." "That sounds suspiciously convenient." "Perhaps." His eyes held mine for a second longer than necessary. Something shifted in the atmosphere between us. Not uncomfortable, just noticeable, like the first notes of a song you almost recognize. I accepted the umbrella and ran my fingers along the handle. Most people would have bought a new one and forgotten about this. Most people are probably smarter than me. Another laugh escaped before I could stop it. The conversation flowed more easily after that. We talked about books, coffee, the city. He asked questions that suggested genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. Most people listened while waiting for their turn to speak. Gabriel listened as though every answer mattered. That alone made him different. Yet there was also something he never talked about, himself. Whenever the conversation drifted toward his life, he redirected it smoothly. Not suspiciously, just carefully. "What do you do?" I eventually asked. A business, I groaned. That is the most vague answer in human history. It is technically accurate. That means you definitely do something complicated. A rare smile appeared. Real this time, not the almost smile from the start, not the guarded expression I remembered. An actual smile. It changed his entire face, made him look younger somehow, less distant. For a moment I forgot how intimidating he had seemed when we first met. Then his phone buzzed. The change was immediate, not dramatic, just subtle. His posture straightened, his attention sharpened. The easy atmosphere disappeared behind something controlled and disciplined. He glanced at the screen and stood. I have to go. Disappointment arrived before I could hide it. Strange. We had only been talking for 40 minutes. Important business? I asked. Unfortunately, he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Then he hesitated. Grace. Yes. For a second it looked like he wanted to say something more. Instead he simply nodded toward the umbrella resting beside me. I am glad I had the chance to return it. Then he walked away. I watched him disappear through the coffee shop door and into the crowded Manhattan sidewalk beyond. What I did not see was the black SUV waiting at the curb. What I did not know was that several people immediately stepped aside when he approached. And what I definitely did not know was that Gabriel Romano spent the entire ride downtown thinking about the smile of a schoolteacher who had somehow become the most unexpected part of his week. For the next several days, I kept catching myself smiling at absolutely nothing. It was embarrassing. I would be standing at the copy machine at school or waiting in line for coffee and suddenly remember a conversation from that afternoon. The way Gabriel had answered questions, the way he listened, the way he somehow made silence feel comfortable instead of awkward. I told myself it was simply refreshing to meet someone different, someone who did not spend every conversation staring at a phone screen. That explanation worked for exactly 2 days. By the third day, my best friend noticed. Okay, Emily said, dropping into the chair across from me during lunch break. Who is he? I nearly choked on my coffee. Who is who? The man. She pointed a French fry at me. You have been smiling at invisible people all week. I have not. Grace, fine, I sighed dramatically. Maybe I met someone interesting. Emily's eyes widened instantly. Interesting how? I do not know yet, which happened to be the truth. I still knew surprisingly little about Gabriel. He remained a collection of contradictions, warm but distant, open but private, present but somehow unreachable. The more I thought about him, the more curious I became. Meanwhile, several miles away, Gabriel Romano was having a completely different problem. You smiled. The accusation came from Luca, one of the few people who had known Gabriel long enough to speak honestly around him. Gabriel looked up from a report. I am sorry? Yesterday. Luca leaned back in his chair. You smiled. People smile. You do not. Gabriel stared at him. This is fascinating. Get out. You have become significantly less unpleasant recently. Luca, I am leaving. He stood and headed toward the door. But for the record, whoever she is, keep her around. The office door closed before Gabriel could respond. He sat in silence for several seconds afterward. Then he looked toward the city beyond the window. The truth was annoying. Luca was right. Something had changed. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone outside his inner circle to notice, but enough. Meetings felt less exhausting. Long days felt shorter. The constant weight he carried seemed slightly lighter than before. And every time he tried to identify the reason, he found himself thinking about a school teacher with kind eyes and an old umbrella. Saturday arrived with clear skies and cool temperatures, perfect weather for the annual community reading event in Bryant Park. Every year, local teachers volunteered to read stories to children while families gathered around blankets and folding chairs. It was one of my favorite traditions. By noon, the park buzzed with activity. Children raced between tables. Parents carried cups of coffee. Laughter drifted through the autumn air. I had just finished reading a chapter from Charlotte's Web when applause erupted from the small audience gathered around me. Several children immediately launched into questions. Is Wilbur real? Can pigs actually be friends with spiders? Why are books better than movies? The last question sparked a heated debate. I loved every second of it. Afterward, I escaped toward a quieter corner of the park carrying a bottle of water. That was when I saw him. Gabriel stood near a fountain on the opposite side of the walkway. My heart reacted before my brain did. Fast, unexpectedly fast. He noticed me at the exact same moment. Then something happened that surprised me. He looked genuinely pleased, not polite, not reserved, happy. The expression transformed his face. Grace, I walked closer. Are you stalking literary events now? I support education. That sounds suspiciously like another vague business answer. A laugh escaped him, an actual laugh. Warm and low and completely different from anything I had heard before. For a moment I simply stared. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," I smiled. "I just realized you are capable of laughing. I will try not to make a habit of it." We started walking together through the park. The conversation flowed naturally, just as it had inside the coffee shop. We talked about childhood books, favorite places in New York, ridiculous subway experiences. At one point, Gabriel admitted he had never successfully assembled furniture without leftover parts. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my water. "That is impossible. I assure you it is not." "You are telling me a successful businessman cannot build a bookshelf?" "Correct. That is honestly comforting." "Why?" "Because it proves you are human." For a brief second something unreadable crossed his face, almost sadness, almost longing. Then it disappeared. They announced the beginning of another reading session nearby. Children hurried past us carrying books and snacks. One little girl accidentally dropped a stuffed rabbit while running. Before I could react, Gabriel bent down, picked it up and returned it to her. The child smiled brightly. "Thank you, mister." Gabriel nodded. The little girl ran off. Simple moment, tiny moment, yet something about it stayed with me, because the kindness looked effortless, natural, like helping people was not unusual for him at all. The afternoon sun dipped lower across the skyline. Eventually we reached the edge of the park where our paths separated. Neither of us seemed eager to leave. "I had a good time," I admitted. Gabriel's gaze softened. "So did I." For a second neither of us moved, then his phone vibrated. The familiar wall returned. Just enough, responsibility pulling him back toward a world I still did not understand. "I should go," he said quietly. "Important business?" I asked. Unfortunately, there was that smile again, smaller this time, yet somehow more meaningful. He hesitated before adding, "Would you like to have dinner sometime?" Simple, direct, unexpected. And judging by the way my heart immediately forgot how to behave, my answer had already arrived before he finished asking. For a moment, all I could do was stare at him. The noise of Bryant Park seemed to fade into the background. Children laughed somewhere behind us. A dog barked near the fountain. Leaves drifted across the walkway in the afternoon breeze. Yet my entire attention remained fixed on Gabriel. "Are you asking me on a date?" I finally said. "I believe that is the traditional interpretation," I laughed. Then yes, something changed in his eyes. Relief, genuine relief. It appeared and vanished so quickly that I almost thought I imagined it. "Good," he said quietly. "Good." Our first dinner happened 3 nights later. The restaurant sat on a quiet street in Manhattan, elegant without being intimidating. The kind of place where conversations mattered more than appearances. I spent nearly 30 minutes deciding what to wear before reminding myself how ridiculous that was. Then I changed outfits twice anyway. By the time I arrived, Gabriel was already there. He stood when he saw me. Somehow that simple gesture felt more meaningful than grand displays ever could. "You look beautiful," he said. Heat immediately climbed into my cheeks. "Thank you." His gaze lingered for half a second before he pulled out my chair. The evening should have felt awkward. 2 lives from completely different worlds. Instead, it felt surprisingly easy. We talked for hours about childhood memories, favorite teachers, places we wanted to visit. At one point, I learned Gabriel preferred old bookstores to luxury shopping. At another point, he admitted he secretly enjoyed terrible reality television. "I do not believe you," I said. "It is true. You are telling me a serious businessman watches people argue over vacation houses?" I never claimed it was logical. I laughed so hard the couple at the next table smiled at us. Throughout the evening I noticed something else. People recognized him. Not openly, not dramatically, but enough. Restaurant staff greeted him with unusual respect. Several guests glanced his direction more than once. One man even approached briefly to shake his hand. "You really are successful, aren't you?" I asked after the man left. Gabriel leaned back slightly. I have done well. That answer somehow revealed nothing while confirming everything. I studied him for a second. The expensive watch, the tailored jacket, the effortless confidence. Looking back, the clues had always been there. "You know," I said, "I think you might be the wealthiest person I have ever had dinner with." A smile touched his face. "Is that a problem?" "Not unless you start ordering gold-covered desserts. I will keep that in mind." The night stretched on longer than either of us expected. When we finally stepped outside, the city glowed beneath a canopy of lights. Traffic rolled through the streets. Music drifted from distant rooftops. New York felt almost magical. We walked several blocks together. Neither of us seemed eager to end the evening. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course." "Why me?" The question surprised him. I could see it. "What do you mean?" You could spend time with anyone, yet somehow you keep choosing the elementary school teacher who once gave away her umbrella. For a moment he said nothing. The city moved around us. Headlights reflected across wet pavement from an earlier rain. Somewhere above us a helicopter crossed the skyline. Gabriel's expression grew thoughtful. Do you know how many people ask me what I can do for them within the first 5 minutes of meeting me? I frowned. A lot, more than you would believe. His voice remained calm. You were different. I looked away briefly. Because I gave you an umbrella? Because you expected nothing in return. The sincerity in his tone stole every clever response I had prepared. We continued walking in silence for a few moments. Comfortable silence, the kind that only exists when two people genuinely enjoy each other's company. Then his phone rang. The sound seemed almost as Gabriel glanced at the intrusive. Instantly something shifted. Not fear, not anger, just responsibility, heavy and unavoidable. He declined the call. Seconds later it rang again, then a third time. You should answer it, I said. His jaw tightened slightly. It can wait, Gabriel. He exhaled slowly. One moment. His voice dropped lower, professional, controlled. I could not hear every word. Only fragments, meetings, timelines. Problems that needed immediate attention. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet when he returned, I noticed the familiar distance in his eyes, the same distance I had glimpsed before. Like part of him belonged somewhere I could not follow. Everything okay? I asked. Yes. The answer arrived too quickly. Not quite a lie, not quite the truth. We reached my apartment building shortly afterward. The evening had been wonderful, yet an odd feeling lingered beneath the happiness. Curiosity, questions. Pieces that did not fit to kind. Intelligent, thoughtful, but there was still a part of his life hidden behind locked doors, a part he never discussed, a part that seemed to call him away whenever we grew too close. Standing outside my building, I found myself wondering what exactly he was keeping from me, and for the first time since the night we met I realized I wanted the answer. Some truths do not arrive like lightning, they arrive quietly. One small piece at a time, until suddenly the entire picture changes. The following week began normally. At least it appeared normal on the surface. I taught classes, attended faculty meetings, shared lunch with Emily, her relentless campaign to learn everything about Gabriel. Unfortunately for her, there was not much to report. We had dinner twice more, coffee once, a long walk through Central Park on Sunday afternoon. Every time we spent time together, I liked him more. Every time we said goodbye, I felt the same frustration. There were still gaps in his story, entire sections of his life hidden behind careful answers and polite smiles. Then Tuesday happened. I was leaving school later than usual after helping prepare decorations for an upcoming literacy fundraiser. The sun had already disappeared behind the skyline, leaving Manhattan wrapped in golden evening light. My phone buzzed as I stepped onto the sidewalk. A text from Gabriel, thinking about you. Simple, ridiculously effective. I smiled before I could stop myself. Then I noticed something strange. Across the street, two men stood beside a parked sedan. They were not doing anything suspicious, not really. Yet the moment they saw me looking, both immediately glanced away. I kept walking. Half a block later, I noticed them again. Still there, still watching. A chill slipped down my spine. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe not. By the time I reached the subway station, the feeling had faded. I convinced myself I was imagining things. Unfortunately, the feeling returned the next day. Different locations, different faces. Yet the same sensation lingered. Someone seemed interested in my routine, not threatening, just observant. The realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. That evening I mentioned it to Gabriel during dinner. The effect was immediate. His expression changed so quickly I almost missed it. What do you mean they were watching you? He asked. His voice remained calm, but something underneath it sharpened. I shrugged. It is probably nothing, Grace. The way he said my name made me pause. I noticed a few people looking my direction, that is all. He set down his fork. Did they approach you? No. Speak to you? No. Follow you? Not that I know of. Gabriel stared at the table for several seconds, longer than necessary, longer than comfortable. When he finally looked up, the warmth had returned to his expression, but I could tell something was different. You should be careful, he said quietly. That sounds dramatic, perhaps. Gabriel. I leaned forward slightly. Do you know something? His eyes met mine. For a moment I thought he might tell me the truth, whatever truth he carried behind those walls. Instead he shook his head. I just want you safe. The answer should have reassured me. Somehow it did not. Later that night, Gabriel stood inside a private office overlooking the city while several trusted associates waited nearby. The atmosphere felt heavier than usual. "How long?" Gabriel asked. "3 days," Luca replied. Gabriel's jaw tightened. "And nobody informed me?" "We wanted confirmation first." Silence followed, cold, controlled, dangerous only because of how calm it remained. Luca placed several photographs on the desk, images taken from a distance, images of Grace leaving school, entering a bookstore, walking through Manhattan streets. Nothing harmful, nothing illegal. Gabriel studied each photograph carefully. "Who are they?" "We are still investigating." Gabriel looked back toward the city lights beyond the glass. Every instinct told him the situation would become more complicated before it became simpler. The problem was not Grace. The problem was his world, a world he had spent weeks keeping separate from hers, a world that now seemed determined to close the distance. The following afternoon I arrived home to a small package waiting outside my apartment door. No return address, no note. Confused, I carried it inside and opened it on the kitchen table. Inside sat a personal safety alarm and a simple card. "For peace of mind." My heart immediately recognized it before my brain did. "Gabriel." I picked up my phone. He answered on the second ring. "You sent this?" "Yes." "Why?" A brief pause followed. "Because it helps me sleep better." The honesty caught me off guard. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I found myself smiling. "You worry too much." A soft laugh reached my ear. "That is entirely possible." Yet after the call ended, I remained standing by the window looking down at the city below. Somewhere out there, Gabriel was carrying burdens he refused to discuss. Somewhere out there, strangers seemed interested in my life for reasons I did not understand. And for the first time since we met, a quiet question settled into my heart. What if the mystery surrounding Gabriel was far bigger than I had imagined? The truth found me on a rainy Thursday afternoon, not through a dramatic confession, not through some shocking revelation delivered at the perfect moment. It arrived because I accidentally typed Gabriel Romano's name into an internet search bar. I had spent days trying to ignore the growing questions in my mind, the strange attention, the anonymous help, the way people reacted around him, the carefully guarded answers whenever conversations drifted toward his personal life. Eventually curiosity won. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside me and opened my laptop. The first search result looked harmless enough. Business articles, charity foundations, real estate investments, community projects, successful entrepreneur. I felt slightly ridiculous for doubting him. Then I kept reading. A different article appeared, then another, then another. Photographs accompanied the headlines. Gabriel entering private meetings. Gabriel surrounded by secured organizations I did not fully understand. Powerful organizations, influential organizations. The deeper I searched, the more uneasy I became. Some articles praised him, others questioned him. A few hinted at rumors that seemed impossible to verify. Yet one fact appeared consistently across every source. Gabriel Romano was not simply a businessman. He was one of the most powerful figures in New York. The kind of man whose name opened doors and silenced rooms. The kind of man people discussed carefully. I stared at the screen while my heartbeat gradually accelerated. Suddenly dozens of small moments rearranged themselves inside my memory. The black SUV. The constant security, the phone calls, the respect people showed him, the resources that seemed to appear whenever someone needed help. None of it had been random, none of it had been ordinary. My phone buzzed. Gabriel. For several seconds I simply stared at his name. Then I answered. "Hello?" Immediately he sensed something was wrong. "Grace?" His voice softened. "What happened?" I closed my eyes. "Who are you?" Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that says more than words ever could. "Grace." "No." I stood and walked toward the window. Rain streaked across the glass. Below, Manhattan moved through another ordinary afternoon while my world quietly shifted beneath my feet. "Tell me the truth." Another pause, longer this time. "Where are you?" he asked. "At home. I am coming over, Gabriel." My voice broke slightly. "Just answer the question." When he finally spoke, the honesty in his tone hurt more than any lie could have. "I wanted to tell you, but you did not. I was trying to find the right moment." I laughed softly, not because anything felt funny. Because disappointment often sounds like laughter before it becomes sadness. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you been keeping this from me?" "Since the beginning." The words landed like stones. "Since the beginning. Since the umbrella. Since the coffee shop. Since every conversation where I believed we were slowly learning each other. You let me believe you were just a businessman. Part of me is Gabriel." I turned away from the window. "Do you understand how this looks?" His answer came quietly. "Yes." "Then why?" For the first time since I met him, I heard genuine pain in his voice. Not frustration, not annoyance. Pain, because every time I tried to tell you, I was afraid you would look at me differently afterward. The honesty stole my next response. Because part of me understood exactly what he meant. I did look at him differently now. Not because of the money, not because of the influence, because secrets change people. Secrets create distance. And suddenly I could not tell where the real Gabriel ended and the carefully constructed version began. An hour later, there was a knock on my apartment door. I already knew who it was. Gabriel stood in the hallway wearing a dark coat damp from the rain. He looked tired. More tired than I had ever seen him. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, I stepped aside and allowed him inside. The apartment felt smaller than usual, quieter. He remained standing while I sat on the couch. Distance separated us, physical and emotional. Everything you found online is not the whole story, he said. Then tell me the whole story. And for the next hour he did. Not every detail, not every secret, but enough. Enough for me to understand the responsibility he carried, the pressure, the expectations, the complicated world surrounding him. He never asked for sympathy. He simply told the truth. When he finished, silence filled the room again. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Evening shadows stretched across the floor. Finally, I looked at him, the man who had protected me, helped my students, remembered my favorite coffee order, the man who kept appearing whenever life felt heavier than usual, yet also the man who had hidden an enormous part of himself from me. I do not know what to do with this, I admitted. Gabriel lowered his gaze briefly. I know. For several seconds neither of us moved. Then I stood. I need time. His eyes closed for a moment, just a moment, but long enough for me to see how much those words cost him. When he opened them again, the familiar calm had returned. If that is what you need. I walked him to the door. The distance between us felt impossible to measure. Before leaving, Gabriel turned toward me one last time. There were 100 things he could have said. 100 arguments he could have made. Then he left. I watched from my apartment window as the black SUV disappeared into the rain, and for the first time since the night we met, I wondered whether the story between us had just reached its end. The hardest part about losing someone is not the silence. It is all the moments when you instinctively reach for them and remember they are no longer there. 3 weeks passed. 3 long weeks filled with unfinished conversations and unanswered feelings. I threw myself into work because it was easier than thinking, easier than wondering whether I had made the right decision, easier than admitting how much I missed him. Every morning I arrived at school early. Every evening I stayed late. My students noticed. "You are miserable," she informed me over lunch one Tuesday. "I am busy. You are miserable and busy." I rolled my eyes, but the truth stung because it was accurate. The apartment felt emptier than before. Coffee tasted different. Even the city seemed quieter somehow. The worst part was that Gabriel respected my request completely. No unexpected visits, no messages, no attempts to change my mind. He simply disappeared from my daily life, which should have made moving on easier. Somehow it made it harder. One rainy afternoon, I stayed after school, helping organize books for the upcoming reading program. By the time I finally left, darkness had already settled across Manhattan. The streets glistened beneath reflections of traffic lights and storefront signs. I pulled my coat tighter and headed toward the subway station. Halfway there, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, I ignored unknown calls. Something made me answer anyway. "Hello?" A brief pause followed. Then a man's voice. "Calm, Miss Morgan? Yes, I apologize for contacting you unexpectedly. My name is Luca." The name felt vaguely familiar. "Okay, I work with Gabriel Romano." My heart immediately forgot how to behave. "Why are you calling me?" Another pause. "Because Gabriel would never ask for help himself." I stopped walking. Rain tapped softly against my umbrella. Pedestrians moved around me in both directions. "What happened?" "Nothing dangerous," Luca said quickly. "But he has not been himself." I closed my eyes. His voice carried genuine sincerity. I know he should have been honest sooner, but for what it is worth, I have known him for over 15 years. I have never seen him care about anyone the way he cares about you. The words settled heavily in my chest. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because some people spend their entire lives searching for something real." He exhaled slowly. "When they finally find it, it would be a shame to lose it because of fear." Before I could respond, the call ended. I stood beneath the rain for several moments, staring at the dark screen. Part of me felt frustrated, another part felt strangely emotional, because despite everything, I knew Luca was not entirely wrong. That night sleep refused to come. Memories kept replaying inside my head. The bookstore, the coffee shop, the reading event, the way Gabriel always listened, the way he remembered small details, the way he protected people without asking for recognition. Eventually I gave up and walked into the living room. City lights shimmered beyond the window. My gaze landed on a familiar object resting near the bookshelf, the faded navy umbrella. I had not used it since getting it back, yet somehow I had never put it away either. I picked it up and smiled despite myself. The next morning brought another surprise. During homeroom, the principal asked me to stop by her office. "Good news?" she announced the moment I entered. "The Literacy Foundation approved our grant." I blinked. Already, not only approved. She handed me paperwork, fully funded. My eyes widened. The amount was enormous. Enough to transform programs for hundreds of students. Enough to help families for years. "Who donated this?" I asked, smiled. "Anonymous benefactor." Of course. My heart knew before my mind did. Later that evening, I sat alone in my apartment reading through project plans when a news story appeared on television. I almost ignored it. Then a familiar face appeared on screen. Gabriel. The reporter discussed a major community investment initiative. Schools, libraries, youth programs. Hundreds of millions of dollars directed toward neighborhoods often overlooked. The camera captured Gabriel speaking briefly during the announcement. Calm, composed, professional, yet something about him looked different. Tired, perhaps. The interview ended after less than a minute, but one sentence stayed with me. A reporter asked why the project mattered so much. Gabriel paused before answering, because sometimes one act of kindness can change the direction of a person's life. My breath caught. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows again. The same sound that had accompanied the night we met. The same sound that seemed connected to every turning point afterward. I walked toward the window and stared down at the city below. Somewhere out there, Gabriel was still carrying the weight of his complicated world. Somewhere out there, he was still respecting the distance I had asked for. And standing there in the soft glow of Manhattan lights, I finally admitted something I had been avoiding for weeks. I was not angry anymore. I was hurt, I was confused, I was scared. But beneath all of that, one truth remained impossible to ignore. I still loved him. Love does not always return with certainty. Sometimes it returns as a question you can no longer ignore. 3 days after watching that interview, I found myself standing outside a building I never expected to visit. The headquarters of Gabriel's Foundation rose above Midtown Manhattan in glass and steel, reflecting the afternoon sun across the surrounding streets. I had walked past the entrance twice already. Both times I kept going. Both times fear convinced me to wait another day. But eventually I realized something important. If I truly wanted answers, I could not keep hiding behind distance. I stepped inside. The lobby was elegant but surprisingly welcoming. Children's artwork decorated one wall. Photographs of community projects covered another. Schools, libraries, youth centers, faces smiling back from neighborhoods all across New York. A receptionist greeted me politely. "Can I help you?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "I am here to see Gabriel Romano." Moments later, I was riding an elevator toward the top floor, wondering whether I had completely lost my mind. When the doors opened, a familiar voice stopped me before I reached the reception desk. "Grace?" I turned. Luca stood several feet away, holding a folder. His expression shifted from surprise to relief almost instantly. "You came, apparently," he smiled. "He is going to be very happy to see you." The words made my stomach tighten. "Is he here?" Before Luca could answer, another voice reached us from the far end of the hallway. "Grace!" Everything inside me stopped. Gabriel stood near a conference room doorway. For a second, neither of us moved. Weeks of silence seemed to stretch between us. He looked thinner than I remembered, more tired, yet his eyes remained exactly the same, steady, focused, honest. Luca quietly disappeared without another word. Suddenly it was just us. "Hi," I said softly. Gabriel almost smiled. "Hi." Neither of us seemed prepared for how difficult a simple greeting could feel. Finally he stepped closer. "Are you okay?" The question made me laugh quietly. "That is your first question. It is the one I care about most." There he was. The man I had missed every day since asking him to leave. We ended up walking through the foundation offices together. Staff members greeted Gabriel warmly. Volunteers moved between meeting rooms carrying reports and project plans. Everywhere I looked, people seemed genuinely invested in helping others. The image I had built in my mind after discovering the truth suddenly felt incomplete. "You spend a lot of time here," I observed. "Most of my time." "Why?" Gabriel looked around the room before answering. Such a simple response. Yet I believed him completely. We eventually reached a rooftop terrace overlooking Manhattan. The city stretched endlessly beneath a clear blue sky. Traffic moved like rivers of light between buildings. For several moments neither of us spoke. "I missed you." The honesty hit harder than I expected. I looked down at the skyline below. "I missed you too." Silence followed, not awkward, just fragile, like something broken trying to heal. "Grace." His voice lowered slightly. "I know I hurt you." I nodded. "You did." He accepted the words without argument. "I was afraid." I looked up. "Of what?" A sad smile touched his face. "That if you knew everything you would leave." Emotion tightened my chest. "Gabriel, I did leave, I know." The pain in those two words was impossible to miss. He turned toward the city again. The ironic part is that hiding the truth caused the exact thing I feared. For a long moment I simply watched him, the powerful man everyone respected. The man who seemed capable of solving impossible problems. Yet standing beside me now, he looked surprisingly human, vulnerable even. "Why did you keep helping people?" I asked quietly. "What? The schools, the programs, the donations?" Gabriel shrugged slightly. "Even when nobody knew it was you, especially then, something inside me shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough, because for the first time I realized I had been asking the wrong question. I kept focusing on who Gabriel was connected to, what influence he carried, what complicated world surrounded him. But none of those things explained the person standing beside me. Actions did, kindness did, character did. And every important action I had witnessed pointed toward the same truth. Gabriel had never tried to impress me. He had only tried to protect me. As the afternoon sunlight painted the city gold, I finally reached for his hand. His eyes widened slightly. Surprise, hope, relief, all at once. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to, because standing above Manhattan with the wind moving gently around us, both of us understood something had changed. The distance between us was finally beginning to disappear. Some people think love changes everything in a single moment. They are wrong. Love changes things slowly, through choices, through patience, through the decision to stay when leaving would be easier. The weeks after that afternoon on the rooftop felt different. Not perfect, not effortless, just honest. For the first time since we met, Gabriel stopped hiding parts of his life from me. He did not overwhelm me with details. He simply answered questions when I asked them, and more importantly, he trusted me with the truth. In return, I stopped looking at him through the lens of headlines and rumors. I focused on the man standing in front of me, the man whose actions never matched the frightening image strangers sometimes imagined. Autumn gradually surrendered to winter. New York transformed beneath strings of holiday lights and storefront decorations. One evening, Gabriel accompanied me to a school fundraiser. The event was small: folding tables, homemade desserts, construction paper decorations created by third graders. The kind of gathering most powerful men would politely avoid. Gabriel arrived early, stayed late, bought raffle tickets from every student who approached him. By the end of the evening, half the children were following him around like he was a celebrity. "You realize they love you now," I told him, as we carried supplies toward the parking lot. Snowflakes drifted through the cold air around us. Gabriel glanced back toward the school entrance, where several students waved enthusiastically through the glass doors. A rare smile appeared. "The feeling seems mutual," I laughed softly. "You are surprisingly good with children. That is because they are honest." We continued walking through the gentle snowfall. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Gabriel stopped. I turned toward him. Something about his expression immediately caught my attention. Thoughtful, serious, certain, Grace. The way he said my name made my heart skip. "What is it?" He looked toward the city's skyline in the distance before meeting my eyes again. "I have been making changes." A quiet breath escaped him, the kind I should have made a long time ago. Over the following weeks, I began understanding exactly what he meant. Gabriel started stepping away from parts of his world that no longer reflected the future he wanted. More responsibility shifted toward legitimate business operations and community projects. More time went toward schools, foundations, and programs designed to help families. It was not a dramatic transformation. It was something far more meaningful, a deliberate one. One afternoon I visited his office unexpectedly. The receptionist directed me toward a conference room overlooking Manhattan. When I entered, several executives were gathering documents after a meeting. They greeted Gabriel with obvious respect before leaving us alone. I walked toward the large windows. "Busy day?" He joined me beside the glass. "Productive day." I studied him carefully. He looked lighter somehow, emotionally, as though a burden he had carried for years was finally becoming easier to set down. You seem happy, I said. Gabriel turned toward me. I am. Simple answer, complete answer. Then he reached into a desk drawer and removed a folder. Something I wanted you to see. Curious, I opened it. Architectural drawings filled the pages, educational facilities, community spaces, scholarship programs, expansion plans for literacy initiatives across multiple boroughs. My eyes widened with every page. Gabriel, the foundation is growing. This is incredible. He nodded toward one specific page. Look closer, I did. Then I froze. Printed across the top of the proposal was a name, the Grace Morgan Literacy Center. For several seconds I could not speak. You named it after me? My voice barely worked. You inspired it. Emotion rushed through me so quickly I had to look away. Gabriel, that is too much. No. His voice remained calm. Certain, it is not enough. I closed the folder carefully and stared at him, the powerful businessman, the complicated man. The man who once stood alone in a storm believing kindness had disappeared from the world. Somewhere along the way, both of us had changed. Not because we rescued each other from danger, because we reminded each other who we wanted to become. A few days later, while walking through Central Park beneath bare winter trees, Gabriel suddenly stopped near a frozen fountain. I looked back. What? Instead of answering immediately, he reached into his coat pocket. My heartbeat accelerated before I even understood why. Snow rested lightly across the pathways around us. The city seemed unusually quiet. Then Gabriel smiled, nervous for perhaps the first time since I met him, and in that moment I realized my life was about to change again. For a moment the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Snow rested quietly on the branches above us. The frozen fountain reflected the pale winter sunlight. Somewhere in the distance children laughed as they crossed the park with their families. Yet all I could see was Gabriel. He stood a few feet away, holding a small velvet box in one hand. Nervous, hopeful, human, more human than I had ever seen him. Grace, he said softly. My heart was beating so hard I could barely hear anything else. Before you answer, there is something I need to say. I nodded. Gabriel glanced down briefly before meeting my eyes again. You changed my life. Emotion tightened my throat instantly. Gabriel? He shook his head gently. No, let me finish. The winter wind moved softly around us. Before I met you, I thought strength meant carrying everything alone. I thought responsibility meant never needing anyone. Then one rainy night, a stranger handed me an umbrella and treated me like an ordinary person. Tears threatened to appear. You reminded me that kindness still exists. You reminded me that trust is worth the risk. You reminded me that the future can look different from the past. His voice grew quieter, more vulnerable, and every good thing that has happened since then began with you. The city disappeared, the snow disappeared, everything disappeared except the man standing in front of me. Then Gabriel opened the box. A simple diamond caught the afternoon light. Elegant, beautiful, timeless, just like the moment itself. Grace Morgan, he said. His voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Will you marry me? I laughed and cried at the same time. The answer arrived before he finished asking yes. Gabriel closed his eyes briefly as relief washed across his face. Then he smiled, a real smile. The kind that still felt rare enough to be precious. He slipped the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly. Around us, a few nearby strangers noticed what had happened and began applauding. I barely heard them, because at that moment, the only thing that mattered was the future standing directly in front of me. 1 year later, sunlight poured through the windows of a small chapel overlooking the Hudson River. Fresh flowers lined the aisle. Family and friends filled every seat. Emily cried before the ceremony even started. Luca claimed he was not emotional while clearly being emotional, and Gabriel stood at the front of the room looking at me the same way he had looked at me beneath that street lamp months earlier. Like I had given him something priceless. The ceremony itself felt surprisingly simple. No grand spectacle, no unnecessary extravagance. Just promises, honest promises, two people choosing each other. When the officiant finally pronounced us husband and wife, applause filled the room. Gabriel kissed my forehead gently and whispered thank you. I smiled through happy tears. For what? His eyes softened. For stopping that night. Married life turned out to be less dramatic than movies suggest and far more beautiful than I expected. We built routines together, morning coffee, evening walks, weekend visits to schools and community centers. The foundation continued growing. The literacy center opened its doors. Hundreds of children gained access to books, tutors, and opportunities they otherwise might never have received. Every time I visited, I felt overwhelmed knowing how many lives were being changed, not because of money, because someone cared enough to act. 2 years later, life surprised us again, this time in the form of a little girl with Gabriel's dark hair and my stubborn determination. The first moment he held our daughter, I watched something transform inside him. Every wall, every defense, every piece of armor he had spent years building seemed to disappear. She wrapped her tiny hand around his finger, and Gabriel Romano became completely helpless. It was honestly adorable. One spring afternoon, several years later, rain tapped gently against the windows of our home. I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner while our daughter played in the living room. Suddenly her voice echoed through the house. "Daddy?" Gabriel looked up from the book he was reading. "Yes?" "Why do you keep this old umbrella?" I froze immediately, because sitting inside a glass display case near the bookshelf was a faded navy umbrella with one slightly bent metal rib. The same umbrella, the one that started everything. Our daughter carried it carefully toward him. Gabriel accepted it with a smile that held an entire lifetime of memories. "Because it is." "Why?" she asked. He looked toward me. Our eyes met across the room, then he turned back to her. "Because that is where our family began." "An umbrella started our family?" Gabriel laughed. "In a way, yes." She seemed satisfied with that explanation and ran off toward her toys. I walked over and sat beside him. Outside, rain continued falling softly against the glass, just another ordinary spring storm, yet somehow it felt familiar. Gabriel slipped an arm around my shoulders. I rested my head against him. Together we watched our daughter play while evening settled across the city skyline beyond the windows. Years earlier, I had given a stranger shelter from the rain. I thought it was a small act of kindness, nothing more. I was wrong, because sometimes the smallest choices create the biggest changes. Sometimes a single moment alters an entire future, and sometimes love arrives quietly, carrying nothing more than gratitude, hope, and a borrowed umbrella.